The music stopped the moment the Duke of Ashbourne walked through the door. It did not stop all at once. It faded, string by string, as the players noticed the room turning to look at something behind them. Within seconds, the great hall of Lord Camden's house had gone from laughter and violins to a silence so complete that Eleanor Hartley could hear the candles hissing in their sconces. She turned with everyone else. She could not help it. When 200 people all look in the same direction at once, the body moves before the mind agrees to it. The Duke stood just inside the doorway, one gloved hand still resting on the frame as though he had considered leaving again before anyone noticed him. He was tall, dressed in unrelieved black, and even from across the hall, Eleanor could see why the room had gone quiet. The left side of his face bore the marks of old fire, skin drawn tight and pale from temple to jaw, the eyebrow broken by a thin white line that never grew back. It was not a wound anymore. It had healed years ago, but healing had not made it easier to look at, and it seemed no one in the room had learned how. A woman near Eleanor pressed a fan to her mouth and whispered something to her companion. Eleanor did not need to hear the words to guess their shape. She had heard versions of them all evening, ever since the invitations went out with his name on the guest list. The Duke who burned his own house down. The Duke who let his wife die and walked away with only a scar to show for it. The Duke nobody visits, because nobody wants to be alone in a room with him. Eleanor thought the last one was probably true, but not for the reason people meant it. She watched him cross toward the far end of the hall, and she noticed something the whispering woman with the fan did not seem to notice at all. He walked like a man bracing for a blow that never quite landed. His shoulders were set too straight. His jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with vanity, and everything to do with waiting for the next person to flinch. Nobody approached him. A path opened wherever he moved, the crowd parting the way water parts around a stone, and closing again just as quickly once he had passed. Servants refilled his glass without meeting his eyes. Lord Camden gave him a brief, formal bow from a safe distance and did not come any closer than that. Even the young men who might have wanted a word with a duke, for the sake of business or connection, found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. Eleanor had come to this house not as a guest of consequence but as a companion to her aunt. A woman of good name but modest means who liked to be seen at parties she could not really afford to attend. Eleanor herself owned 2 evening dresses, both altered more than once, and she was not entirely sure why she had been permitted through the door at all, except that her aunt insisted a companion added respectability to an aging widow arriving alone. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of person nobody in that hall would remember meeting, which was perhaps why, when the Duke of Ashbourne reached the refreshment table only a few steps from where she stood, and reached for a glass of wine with a hand that was not quite steady, Eleanor did not look away. She had spent 4 years working in other people's houses, first as a companion to an elderly aunt in Dover, then briefly as a governess to a merchant's daughters in Bristol, and she had learned early that people showed you who they were in the moments they thought no one was watching. The Duke thought no one was watching him just then. His eyes were fixed on the wine glass, his mouth pressed into a hard line, and for one unguarded second, the fear underneath the fierce composure showed through as plainly as a crack in glass. He was not dangerous. He was tired. Eleanor did not decide to smile at him. It happened the way a smile happens when you see someone struggling under a weight you recognize, an instinct older than manners. She caught his eye by accident, because he looked up at the wrong moment, straight into her face, clearly expecting to find the same recoil he had found in every other face in the room that night. She smiled instead. It was not a large smile. It was not flirtatious, and it was not pitying, which she suspected he would have hated more than the fear. It was simply the smile a person gives another person, when their eyes happen to meet across a crowded room, small and warm and entirely ordinary. The Duke went very still. For a moment Eleanor thought she had made some terrible mistake, that she had misread the situation and offended him in a way she could not undo. His gray eyes searched her face as though looking for the joke, the trick, the reason a stranger would look at him like that. She held perfectly steady and did not look away, because looking away now would only prove that the smile had been an accident, and it had not been. "You are looking at me," he said. His voice was low, rougher than she expected, as though it was not used often in company. "I believe that is generally what people do at parties," Eleanor said. "Look at one another. It is considered part of the entertainment." Something moved behind his eyes, quick and startled, gone before she could name it. It might have been the beginning of a laugh, if he had remembered how laughing worked. "Most people in this room managed to look everywhere except at me," he said. There was no self-pity in it. He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather, something observed so many times it no longer surprised him, only wearied him. "Then most people in this room are being very rude," Eleanor said, "and I am only doing what is polite." He studied her for a long moment, and she let him, because she understood that he was checking her face for the flicker of disgust that always came late, the kind people tried to hide and could not quite manage. She did not have it to hide. She had grown up with a father whose hands had been burned in a mill accident, scarred past the wrist on both sides, and she had learned before she was 10 years old that a scar was simply a story written on skin, nothing more frightening than that. "You do not know who I am," the Duke said, though it sounded less like an accusation and more like a question he was afraid to ask directly. "I know exactly who you are, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "The whole room has been telling me for the last hour, whether I wanted to hear it or not. And yet you are still standing here. I find I would rather form my own opinion of a person than borrow one from a woman with a fan who has not, as far as I can tell, ever spoken to you in her life." That did it. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Eleanor felt a small, private triumph. It was the first honest expression she had seen cross his face since he walked through the door. "That is either very brave of you," he said, "or very foolish. I have been told it is usually both." He almost laughed then. She watched him catch it, swallow it, as though laughing in public was a thing he had trained himself out of doing, the way a person trains themselves out of a limp long after the injury has healed, simply because it is safer not to draw attention. He set down his wineglass, untouched, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might actually say something more. Instead, a voice called his name from across the hall, sharp and performative, the kind of voice that wanted to be heard by everyone nearby. A man in a deep green coat was crossing toward them with the easy stride of someone who owned every room he entered, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Julian," the man said, arriving beside the Duke and clapping him once on the shoulder, hard enough that Eleanor saw the Duke's jaw tighten. "I did not think you would come tonight. How good of you to make the effort." "Edmund," the Duke said, and something in his voice had changed entirely, gone flat and guarded. The openness of a moment ago folded away like a letter put back in its envelope. "And who is this?" Edmund asked, turning his attention to Eleanor with a look that traveled over her plain dress and unremarkable jewelry, and clearly decided she was not worth the trouble of a proper introduction. "Have you finally found someone willing to brave the company, cousin?" "Miss Hartley was just leaving," the Duke said, before Eleanor could answer for herself. It was not unkind. If anything, she understood a moment later, it was the opposite. He had seen the way his cousin looked at her, the faint cruelty dressed up as charm, and he had moved to end the conversation before it could turn into something that would cost her. But it still stung, being spoken for and sent away in the same breath, and Eleanor felt the loss of it more than she expected to. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said, and dropped a small, proper curtsy, because whatever else had happened in the last 5 minutes, he was still a duke, and she was still nobody in particular. She did not look back as she walked away, though she wanted to. She could feel his eyes on her, and something in her chest had gone strange and unsettled, the way it did when a piece of music ended before she was ready for it to end. Across the hall, her aunt was waiting with a dozen questions about who that man had been and why the Duke of Ashbourne had spoken to her at all. Of every person in the room, Eleanor answered as briefly as she could, because she did not yet have the words for what had actually happened, only the certainty that something had, and that it mattered. She did not know that on the other side of the hall, Julian Ashbourne stood very still for a long moment after she left, staring at the place where she had been standing, feeling something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 3 years. He did not know her name beyond Hartley. He did not know where she lived, or who her family was, or why a woman with nothing to gain from it had looked at his ruined face and smiled as though it were simply a face, the way faces were meant to be looked at. He only knew that no one had smiled at him like that since the fire, and that he had spent 3 years telling himself he did not want anyone to. He had been lying to himself. He understood that now, standing alone at the edge of a ballroom that had gone quiet around him again the moment his cousin walked away, laughing with someone else, forgetting him entirely. The silence did not feel the same as it had an hour ago. An hour ago it had felt like punishment. Now it felt like waiting. He found himself hoping, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he would see Miss Hartley again. 3 days after the party, a carriage bearing the Ashbourne crest stopped in front of the narrow house Eleanor shared with her aunt, and the entire street came out onto their front steps to see why. Eleanor was not so foolish as to think it was a social call. Dukes did not call socially on companions with 2 altered dresses to their name. She smoothed her skirt, told her aunt to stay calm in a tone that suggested she did not believe her aunt was capable of it, and opened the door herself before the footman could knock. Julian Ashbourne stood on the step, hat in hand, looking as uncomfortable as a man could look while still managing to appear entirely composed. Up close, in daylight, the scar was more visible than it had been in the candlelit hall, but Eleanor found she noticed it for perhaps 3 seconds, before her attention moved past it to the rest of his face, which was doing something complicated and nervous that she found far more interesting than old damage to skin. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I hope I have not called at an improper hour." "You have called at an unexpected hour, Your Grace, which is not quite the same thing." She stepped back to let him in, aware of the neighbors' curtains twitching up and down the street. "Though I suspect half of London will hear about this visit by supper." "I am aware," he said, with the faint grimness of a man who had already resigned himself to the gossip and simply decided the errand was worth it anyway. He came to the point quickly, standing rather stiffly in the small front parlor, while Eleanor's aunt hovered in the doorway pretending to arrange flowers that did not need arranging. His younger sister, Lucy, was 12 years old and had gone through 3 governesses in as many years, each one leaving for reasons that were never fully explained to him, though he suspected the truth was simpler than anyone wanted to admit. Lucy lived at Ashbourne Hall with him, largely alone, in a house that visitors avoided and where laughter had become a rare and startling sound. "She needs someone who will not be afraid of the house," Julian said, "or of me." The last governess left after a fortnight. She said the servants told her stories. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that are mostly untrue and entirely unhelpful to a 12-year-old girl trying to learn her letters." He turned his hat over once in his hands, an old habit, she suspected, from moments when he needed somewhere to put his restlessness. "I do not know why I am asking you specifically. I have a house full of servants who could recommend a dozen qualified women. But you looked at me on Thursday night as though I were simply a person standing at a party, and it occurred to me that my sister has not had anyone look at our family that way in 3 years. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, turning the offer over in her mind the way she turned over most decisions, slowly and from several angles. "You are offering me a position because I did not flinch," she said. "I am offering you a position because you are, by every account I have gathered in 3 days of quiet asking, an excellent teacher, patient with difficult children, and unbothered by difficult households." "The not flinching," he said, and here the corner of his mouth did the almost smile she remembered from the ballroom, "was simply what made me brave enough to knock on your door instead of sending a letter through my solicitor like a reasonable man." She laughed before she could stop herself, a short, surprised sound, and watched something in his shoulders ease at the noise of it, as though he had been braced for the conversation to go badly, and had not quite let himself hope otherwise. She accepted 3 days later, after her aunt had finished a lengthy and largely unnecessary lecture about propriety, unmarried women, and the particular dangers of great houses with scarred and reclusive dukes in them, most of which Eleanor privately thought her aunt had invented on the spot for the pleasure of delivering the lecture. Ashbourne Hall, when the carriage finally rolled up its long drive a week later, was not what she had expected. She had imagined something gloomy, shuttered, draped in black the way grief was supposed to drape a house. Instead, she found gray stone warmed by ivy, tall windows that let in enormous amounts of light, and gardens that had clearly been beautiful once and were now simply overgrown, as though whoever tended them had lost interest partway through a season and never quite returned to it. Lucy Ashbourne was waiting in the entrance hall, a thin, watchful girl with her brother's gray eyes and none of his height yet, standing very straight in the way that children stand when they have been taught that a straight spine hides a nervous heart. "You are not what I expected," Lucy said by way of greeting. "Neither are you," Eleanor said. "I was told to expect a difficult child. You seem entirely reasonable so far, and it is only 10 in the morning." Lucy's mouth twitched, fighting a smile the way her brother had fought one, and Eleanor understood in that instant that whatever else this house held, it held 2 people who had forgotten how to let themselves be happy out loud, and had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to give them permission. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Eleanor had not expected to enjoy as much as she did. Mornings were spent with Lucy over books and sums, the girl sharp and quick once she trusted that no one in the room was going to disappear the way the last 3 governesses had. Afternoons, more often than Eleanor had planned for, found her crossing paths with Julian in the library, or the garden, or the long gallery where old paintings of Ashbourne ancestors looked down with expressions that ranged from stern to faintly amused. He was easier to talk to than she had expected a duke to be, once the first careful week had passed. The library became their common ground, A vast room of tall shelves and worn leather chairs that smelled of old paper and wood smoke. And it was there, on a rainy afternoon when Lucy had been sent to bed early with a cold, that Eleanor first discovered how much Julian enjoyed an argument. She had pulled a volume of poetry from the shelf and made the mistake of saying, quite casually, that she found it overwrought. He set down his own book at once, sat forward in his chair, and spent the better part of an hour defending every line of it with the seriousness of a barrister arguing before a judge, until Eleanor was laughing too hard to hold her ground on principle alone. "You argue like a man who has not had anyone disagree with him in years," she said, wiping her eyes. "I have not," he admitted, and something in his voice turned quieter. "People do not argue with dukes, as a rule. Certainly not with this particular duke. I had forgotten it could be enjoyable rather than exhausting." "Then you have clearly been keeping the wrong company." "So it would seem." He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight catching the scarred side of his face without either of them remarking on it, which she noticed had become, in the space of 2 short weeks, an entirely unremarkable thing. "I find I am rather glad my sister needed a governess, Miss Hartley." "As am I, Your Grace, though I suspect for slightly different reasons than you might imagine." He asked her opinion on books often after that, and disagreed with her outright when he thought she was wrong, which she found she liked far better than polite agreement. He listened too, when the conversation turned serious, when she spoke about her father, the mill accident, the years of watching a proud man learn to live inside a body that strangers stared at in the street. One evening, after Lucy had gone up to bed, the housekeeper, a broad, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Price, found Eleanor still awake in the small sitting room off the kitchen, mending a torn hem by candlelight, because she did not yet feel comfortable ringing for a maid to do work she was perfectly capable of doing herself. "You are settling in well, miss," Mrs. Price said, setting down a cup of tea Eleanor had not asked for but was glad to have anyway. "Better than the others did." "The others did not stay long enough to settle at all, from what I understand." "No," Mrs. Price agreed, lowering herself into the chair opposite with the particular relief of a woman who had been on her feet since before dawn, frightened off, most of them, not by his grace, whatever they told themselves, by the talk. There is always talk in a house like this one, and servants carry it faster than anyone upstairs would like to believe. "What sort of talk?" Mrs. Price hesitated, and Eleanor recognized the particular caution of a woman deciding how much loyalty she owed to gossip versus how much she owed to the truth. "About the fire, mostly, and about Mr. Voss, though I oughtn't say more than that. Mr. Voss, the Duke's cousin, the very same. Comes and goes as he pleases, that one. Always has, ever since they were boys together. His Grace has never had the heart to turn away family, even family that does not deserve the kindness." Mrs. Price pressed her lips together, as though she had already said more than she intended, and busied herself instead with asking whether Eleanor found the north bedroom drafty, which Eleanor understood to mean the conversation, for tonight, was finished. She thought about it long after Mrs. Price had gone to bed, turning the housekeeper's careful words over and over, the way one turns over a stone to see what moves underneath it. There was a story in this house larger than the one anyone had told her yet, and she found herself, against every rule of good sense her aunt had ever taught her, wanting very much to know what it was. It was 2 days later, in the garden, pulling weeds from the abandoned rosebed while Lucy chased a barn cat across the lawn, and Julian watched with the closest thing to open contentment Eleanor had yet seen on his face, that she finally worked up the courage to ask him directly. "He never let it make him small," Eleanor said, one afternoon in the garden, pulling absently at a weed that had overtaken what must once have been a rosebed. "That was the thing I admired most. People expected him to shrink, to apologize for existing where they could see him. He refused." "That sounds like a difficult thing to refuse," Julian said quietly. "It is. I imagine you know that better than most." He did not answer for a long moment, looking out over the garden instead of at her, and Eleanor let the silence sit rather than filling it, because she had learned by then that he spoke more honestly when he was not being pressed. "There was a fire," he said finally, 3 years ago. My wife died in it. Everyone believes I caused it, one way or another, through carelessness or temper. The details change depending on who is telling the story. I have never corrected any of them." "Why not?" "Because the truth is worse in its own way, and because for a long time I did not think I deserved to be believed either way." He glanced at her, and something guarded moved behind his eyes, testing her the way he had tested her at the party, waiting for the recoil that never seemed to come. "You are the first person in 3 years who has asked me a direct question about it, instead of either avoiding the subject entirely or repeating a rumor back to me as though it were fact." I find rumors tend to travel faster than truth, Eleanor said, and arrive far less carefully packed. He almost smiled again, and this time it nearly reached completion before he caught himself, as though smiling all the way through was still a muscle he did not entirely trust. You are good for this house, Miss Hartley, he said. Lucy laughs now. I had forgotten what it sounded like. I have done very little, Eleanor said, though warmth rose in her chest at the words regardless. Children generally laugh when they are not afraid. I only removed the fear. The rest was always in her. Perhaps, Julian said. But someone had to be brave enough to walk into a house everyone else avoided and start removing things. He looked at her then, in a way that made Eleanor's breath catch, unguarded and searching, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, the overgrown garden humming quietly around them with bees and late summer heat. It was Lucy's voice calling from the terrace, asking whether they meant to come in for tea before it went entirely cold, that finally broke the moment, and Julian looked away first, clearing his throat, offering Eleanor his arm with a formality that did not quite hide the color that had risen along his unscarred cheek. Eleanor took his arm and said nothing about it, though she thought about it long after tea was finished and the house had gone quiet for the evening, turning the memory over the way she turned over every decision that mattered, slowly, and from several careful angles, already suspecting that this particular decision had stopped being entirely within her control. That morning, before any of it happened, Eleanor had been sitting with Lucy at the schoolroom table, going over a page of sums the girl was working through with more patience than usual, when Lucy set down her pencil without warning and asked a question that had nothing to do with arithmetic at all. Do you think my brother is happier now? Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, because she had learned that Lucy asked very few things without meaning them seriously. I think so. Why do you ask? He laughs more. He used to only laugh with me, and only sometimes, and it always sounded like he was surprised at himself for doing it. Now he laughs with you too, and it sounds different, easier. Lucy traced a finger along the edge of the table, not looking up. I remember the night of the fire, you know, not all of it, pieces, like Mrs. Price says. I remember he carried me out, and his hands were shaking, and he told me to stay on the lawn no matter what happened, and then he went back inside, and I thought he was not going to come back out again. That must have been very frightening for you. It was. I still dream about it sometimes. Lucy finally looked up, her gray eyes so like her brother's that Eleanor felt the resemblance like a small ache. Everyone always asks if I am afraid of the fire. No one ever asks if I am afraid he will disappear again the way he did that night, even just a little, even just inside himself. He has been disappearing like that for 3 years, slowly, like smoke going up a chimney, so slow you almost do not notice until the room is empty. And now? Now he seems to be coming back, Lucy said, with the blunt, unguarded honesty that only children and the very old ever seem to manage. I think it might be because of you. I do not want you to leave the way the others left. I have no intention of leaving, Lucy. People say that, Lucy said, returning to her sums with the sudden, practical closing off of a child who has said more than she meant to, and now wishes to be done with the subject. And then they leave anyway. Eleanor had reached across the table and covered the girl's small hand with her own, not offering empty promises, because she understood by now that Lucy had heard enough empty promises to distrust them entirely, but simply offering the warmth of her hand for as long as Lucy wanted it there. They had sat like that for a while, the schoolroom quiet, dust turning slowly in the afternoon light, before Lucy pulled her hand back and returned to her work as though nothing at all had happened. It was only a few hours later, once the lessons were finished and the light had begun to fade toward evening, that the scream came from the stable yard, sharp and sudden enough that Eleanor dropped the book she was reading and was running before she had fully decided to run. Sharp and sudden enough that Eleanor dropped the book she was reading and was running before she had fully decided to run. She found Lucy pressed against the stable wall, white-faced, staring at a loose horse that had bolted from its stall during evening feeding, and was now circling the yard in a panic, hooves striking sparks off the cobblestones, eyes rolling wild in the lantern light. A stable boy lay on the ground nearby, clutching his arm, having apparently taken a kick trying to catch the animal before it could reach the girl. Eleanor did not think. She stepped between Lucy and the horse, arms spread, speaking low and steady the way her father had once taught her to speak to frightened animals, back when he still worked with the mill horses before his hands were too damaged to hold reins. The horse slowed, snorting, ears flicking toward her voice, and in the space of a few long, careful seconds, it had calmed enough for one of the grooms to catch the trailing rein. It was only after, when Lucy was crying into her shoulder and the stable boy was being helped inside to have his arm looked at, that Eleanor realized Julian had arrived at some point during the commotion, and was standing very still at the edge of the yard, watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. "You could have been hurt," he said, once Lucy had been handed off to Mrs. Price for tea and sympathy and a great deal of fussing. "So could she," Eleanor said. "I was closer." "That is not the same as being the right person to step in front of a frightened horse." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but I did it anyway, and here we both are, entirely unharmed, so I would rather not be scolded for it if it is all the same to you." He exhaled, something between a laugh and a breath he had been holding too long, and crossed the yard toward her in the fading light. Up close she could see his hands were not quite steady, and she understood, with a small ache in her chest, that he had been more frightened than she had. "I am not scolding you," he said. "I am trying to work out how to say thank you, without it sounding like an accusation, and apparently failing. You could simply say thank you. Thank you, Miss Hartley." His voice dropped, rougher than usual. "For Lucy, for all of it." They stood there a moment too long, close enough that Eleanor could see the lantern light catching in the gray of his eyes, close enough that the scarred side of his face was turned fully toward her without either of them thinking to angle away from it. She reached up, before she had quite decided to, and touched her fingers lightly to the ridge of old scar tissue along his jaw. He went very still, the way a man goes still when he is afraid that moving will end something he does not want to end. "Does it hurt?" she asked quietly. "Not anymore, not the skin at least." He did not pull away from her hand, though she felt the effort it cost him to hold steady under her touch, a man unused to being touched gently, or perhaps unused to being touched at all since whatever had happened 3 years ago. "The rest of it hurts more than the burns ever did." "Tell me," Eleanor said. It was not a demand, it was an offer, quiet and open, the same offer she had been making him in small ways since the night of the ball, and she watched him weigh it now, the way he had weighed every honest thing between them, checking her face for the flinch that never came. They sat together on the low stone wall at the edge of the yard, the horse settled now, the stable boy tended to, the evening gone soft and blue around them, and Julian told her the story in pieces, the way a man tells a story he has never once told all the way through. His wife's name had been Beatrice. They had married young, more out of family arrangement than deep affection, though a fondness had grown between them over the 2 years of their marriage, quiet and companionable, the kind of love that asks little and gives steadily. The fire had started in the east wing of the old hall, the wing that had since been pulled down entirely and never rebuilt, in the middle of the night, while most of the household slept. "I woke to smoke," he said. "I got Lucy out first. She was only 9. I carried her to the lawn and told her to stay with the nursemaid and not move, and then I went back in for Beatrice." His hands had curled into fists on his knees, and Eleanor resisted the urge to reach for them, understanding that he needed to finish this on his own terms, at his own pace. The staircase to her rooms had already gone. I could not reach her that way. I went around through the gallery instead, and by the time I got to her door, the smoke was too thick to see, and I could hear her, but I could not find her fast enough. His voice had gone flat, the careful flatness of a man reciting something he had gone over so many times in his own mind that the words had worn smooth, like stones in a river. "The roof came down before I could reach the bed. I got out with this." He touched his own jaw without looking at it, and nothing else. "Nothing else at all." "That is not the same as causing it," Eleanor said softly. "You went back for her. You went back into a burning house for her. Society does not care for that distinction. What they know is that the Duke survived and the Duchess did not, and a man who survives a fire that kills his wife must have done something to deserve surviving it, in their minds, if not in fact. My own cousin was the first to suggest, quite gently, at the funeral, that perhaps I had been careless with a candle that night. It was a small thing to say. It spread like the fire itself." Eleanor felt something cold move through her at the mention of Edmund, a suspicion she could not yet name but which settled uneasily in her chest regardless. "Your cousin said this." Edmund has always had a gift for saying small, terrible things and appearing kind while he says them. Julian looked at her then, and the guardedness that usually lived behind his eyes had thinned to almost nothing. "I have never told anyone the whole of it. Not even Lucy, though she was there and remembers pieces of it herself, in the way children remember things, sideways and in fragments." "Why me?" "Because you asked," he said simply, "and because you did not look away when I said her name. I have watched people's faces very closely for 3 years, Miss Hartley. I know precisely what pity looks like, and what fear looks like, and what polite discomfort looks like when a person is waiting for a decent excuse to change the subject. You have none of those things in your face right now. I do not entirely know what to do with that. You do not have to do anything with it, Eleanor said. You only have to let it be there. He reached for her hand then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when she did not, he held it as though it were something precious and unexpected, turning it over once in his own scarred palm, before simply resting his fingers against hers in the blue evening light. They sat like that for a long while, not speaking, the stable yard quiet around them, the horse settled and dozing in its stall, the whole house behind them lit warm and golden in its windows. Eleanor thought, with the particular clarity that comes only rarely in a life, that she had never felt as certain of anything as she felt of this, sitting on a cold stone wall beside a man the whole of society had decided to be afraid of. Neither of them noticed the figure standing at the edge of the trees beyond the paddock fence, watching the two of them in the lantern light with an expression that held nothing warm in it at all. Edmund Voss had arrived unannounced, as he often did, intending to press Julian for a loan he did not truly need but enjoyed asking for regardless, a small and repeated humiliation he liked to inflict on his cousin under the guise of family closeness. He had not expected to find the Duke sitting hand in hand with a governess in the stable yard, looking, for the first time in 3 years, like a man who might actually recover. That would not do at all. Edmund had spent 3 years cultivating the story that suited him best, the story of a broken, guilty Duke too consumed by grief and shame to remarry, to have an heir of his own, to ever fully step back into the world and threaten Edmund's steady, patient position as the man who would one day inherit everything Julian currently held. A recovered Duke was a Duke who might marry again. A Duke who might marry again was a Duke who might have a son, and a Duke with a son had no further use for a cousin waiting quietly in the wings for a title that was never truly his to begin with. He watched a moment longer, turning the problem over in his mind with the same cold patience he had once used to turn over a candle left too close to old curtains, and then he stepped back into the trees and left as quietly as he had come, already forming the shape of what he would do next. Whatever Miss Hartley was to his cousin, Edmund decided, walking back toward the road where his horse waited, she would not be it for very much longer. He rode not toward his own modest townhouse but toward the estate of Lord Pemberton, a man of good family and thin finances who had, on more than one occasion, made his interest in a well-placed marriage rather plain, and who owed Edmund a great deal of money from a card debt neither of them spoke of openly. Pemberton received him in his study, brandy already poured, the fire banked low, and listened with growing interest as Edmund laid out what he had seen in the stable yard. A governess, Pemberton said, turning his glass slowly. Hardly a threat to anyone's inheritance, surely. You did not see his face, Edmund said. 3 years I have watched my cousin fold in on himself, and in a fortnight this woman has undone all of it. If he marries her, and she gives him a son, everything I have waited for becomes smoke. I did not spend 3 years being patient to lose it now to a governess with a kind smile, and no fortune to her name. And what would you have me do about it? You have always admired a pretty face with no protection behind it, Edmund said, without troubling to soften the observation. I am not asking you to do anything improper, Pemberton, only to make yourself known to her. Attentive, persistent, it would not take much to make my cousin doubt her intentions, if the right rumor reached the right ears at the right time. A governess who accepts the attentions of a lord while living under a duke's roof does not exactly paint a picture of quiet virtue, does she? Pemberton considered this for a long moment, swirling his brandy, weighing the debt he owed against the mild distaste he felt at being used so plainly as a tool. In the end, as Edmund had known he would, the debt won out. I have been meaning to call on Ashbourne regardless, Pemberton said. It has been some time since I paid my respects to an old friend. How thoughtful of you, Edmund said, and permitted himself, for the first time that evening, something close to a smile. He rode home well after midnight, turning the plan over in his mind with the same patient, careful attention he gave to everything, already imagining the particular satisfaction of watching Julian's brief, foolish happiness come apart at the seams, one carefully placed rumor at a time. The weeks since the stable yard had carried a new kind of ease into Ashbourne Hall, the sort Eleanor had not felt in any household she had ever worked in before. Julian had taken to walking with her in the mornings before lessons began, the two of them circling the overgrown gardens while the dew was still on the grass, talking about nothing of great importance and, occasionally, about everything that mattered. He had begun, slowly, to have the roses cut back and the paths cleared, and when Eleanor asked him why, after 3 years of letting the garden run wild, he only said that he had recently remembered there were things in his life worth tending again. Lucy noticed the change too, in the small, delighted way children notice things adults think are hidden. She had taken to leaving the schoolroom door open during lessons so she could hear her brother's footsteps in the hall, and more than once Eleanor caught her watching the two of them across the dinner table with the quiet, satisfied expression of a girl rearranging the furniture of her own hopes. It was into this fragile, newly built piece that Lord Pemberton arrived at Ashbourne Hall 3 days later, unannounced and overly charming. With a bouquet of hothouse flowers he presented to Eleanor in the front hall, as though she were the lady of the house and not the governess employed to educate a 12-year-old girl. "I had heard Ashbourne had acquired a treasure for his sister's education," Pemberton said, bowing over her hand a beat longer than was proper. "I confess I did not expect the treasure to be quite so lovely." Eleanor withdrew her hand as soon as courtesy allowed, and set the flowers aside on the hall table without further comment, though she noted, with growing unease, that Julian had come out into the hall in time to witness the entire exchange, his expression closing over the way it used to close over before she had learned to read past it. "Pemberton," Julian said, "I was not expecting you." "No, I do not suppose you were." Pemberton's smile did not waver. "I was merely passing through the county and thought I would pay my respects to an old friend, and it seems to meet the woman who has apparently transformed your household in a matter of weeks. The whole county is talking about it, Ashbourne. A governess who has the Duke himself smiling at parties again. Quite the accomplishment." The words were pleasant enough on their surface, but Eleanor heard the undertone beneath them, the careful suggestion that her presence in the house was a matter of gossip rather than employment, and she saw Julian hear it too, his jaw tightening in the way it did when he was working very hard to master his temper. "Miss Hartley is employed to teach my sister," Julian said, evenly, "nothing more." "Of course," Pemberton said. "Forgive me. I only meant it as a compliment." He stayed for an hour, too long by any measure of politeness, directing most of his conversation toward Eleanor, with a persistence that felt less like genuine interest and more like a performance for an audience she could not see. It was only after he left that Julian turned to her in the empty hall, and she saw, for the first time since she had arrived at Ashbourne Hall, real doubt moving behind his eyes. "Do you know him?" he asked. "Before today, I mean." "I have never met the man in my life," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended, stung that the question needed asking at all. "Why would you ask me that?" "I am not accusing you of anything," Julian said, though the careful way he said it suggested he was, in fact, working very hard not to. "Pemberton does not simply pass through counties. He does not do anything without a reason, and I have known him long enough to trust that instinct completely." "Then perhaps you ought to ask him his reasons, rather than asking me to account for a man I met for the first time an hour ago," Eleanor said, and left the hall before either of them could say something they would regret, though the damage, she suspected, had already been quietly done. It was the first crack between them, small and hairline, the kind that does not show unless the light falls exactly right, but Eleanor felt it all the same, and she suspected, walking up to her room with her hands trembling slightly at her sides, that this had been precisely the point. Worse came a week later, at a garden party hosted by Lady Whitcomb, a woman whose reputation for gossip was matched only by her reputation for hosting parties no one dared to refuse an invitation to, for fear of becoming the subject discussed at the next one. Eleanor had not wanted to attend, but Lucy had begged to go, and Julian had insisted, gently, that Eleanor accompany them both, and so she found herself standing beneath a striped awning in her best altered dress, watching society circle the Duke of Ashbourne and his party with the same wary fascination they always showed him, only now, she noticed uneasily, some of that fascination had turned toward her. "There she is," she heard a woman murmur, not quite quietly enough, to a companion nearby. "The governess. I hear Lord Pemberton has been quite attentive. One does wonder what a woman in her position hopes to gain, playing two such very different men against one another." Eleanor's face went hot, though she kept her expression carefully still, the way her aunt had trained her to do through years of small humiliations at other people's parties. She did not have to wonder long where the rumor had come from. Across the lawn, Edmund Voss stood in quiet conversation with Lady Whitcomb herself, his head bent close, his expression the picture of reluctant, sorrowful honesty, the exact posture of a man being forced, against his own better judgment, to share something he wished were not true. "I only say it because I worry for my cousin," Eleanor heard him say, as she passed close enough to catch the words, clearly intended for her to catch them. "He has been so isolated these past years. It would be easy for a clever woman to take advantage of a lonely man's trust, particularly one with access to his household and his sister both." Lady Whitcomb made a small, delighted sound of scandal, and Eleanor kept walking, her spine very straight, refusing to give either of them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the words had landed. It reached its worst point an hour later, when Pemberton, well into his third glass of wine, cornered her near the refreshment table, and pressed his attentions with rather less subtlety than he had managed at the house, taking her hand and refusing, for one long uncomfortable moment, to release it, murmuring something about how a woman of her modest position ought to consider her prospects more carefully before turning down a man of his standing. "Release my hand, Lord Pemberton," Eleanor said, low and furious, "or I will make certain everyone at this party hears exactly how you have chosen to conduct yourself." "There is no need for dramatics," Pemberton said, though he did not let go, his grip tightening instead, and Eleanor felt the first true edge of fear she had felt since arriving at Ashbourne Hall, not of Julian, never of Julian, but of this man, and the casual, entitled cruelty behind his charm. "I believe the lady asked you to release her." Julian's voice cut across the lawn like cold water, and every head within earshot turned, the way heads always turned when he entered a room, only this time there was no fear in the silence that followed, only a sharp and sudden attention as the Duke of Ashbourne crossed the grass toward them with an expression that made Pemberton's hand drop from Eleanor's wrist as though it had been burned. "Ashbourne," Pemberton said, attempting a smile that did not quite hold. "We were only talking." "You were holding a woman's arm against her expressed wish," Julian said. "I do not require a lengthy explanation of what that is called." The lawn had gone entirely silent now, every guest at Lady Whitcomb's party turning to watch, and Eleanor understood, with a rush of feeling she did not have time to examine properly, that Julian had just done the one thing he had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. He had made himself the center of attention, deliberately, publicly, on her behalf, in front of every gossiping tongue in the county. "I think it would be best," Julian said, his voice carrying easily across the silent lawn, "if you did not call at Ashbourne Hall again, Pemberton, or approach Miss Hartley at any future gathering either of us happens to attend." Pemberton's face had gone an ugly blotched red, humiliation and wine working together against him, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might say something truly foolish, but he only offered a stiff, shallow bow and withdrew across the lawn, leaving a wake of whispers behind him that Eleanor suspected would take a very long time to settle. Edmund, watching from beneath a nearby tree, allowed himself only the smallest, most private smile. The scene had not gone quite as he had planned. He had hoped for Julian's doubt, not his defense. But a duke who defended his governess so publicly, so passionately, in front of half the county, had given the gossip something even better than scandal to talk about. And gossip, once it reached a certain size, tended to grow entirely on its own, without any further help from him at all. Julian offered Eleanor his arm without a word, and she took it, aware of every eye on the lawn, and together they walked back toward the carriage where Lucy waited, wide-eyed and silent, having watched the entire scene unfold from a safe distance. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, once they were out of earshot of the party. "You should not have to thank me for that," Julian said, and there was something raw in his voice, something that had cracked open during the confrontation and had not yet closed back up. "I am sorry for doubting you, even for a moment after Pemberton's first visit. I should have known better." "You did know better," Eleanor said. "You simply forgot it for an hour, and then you remembered it in front of the entire county, which I think counts for rather more." He looked at her, and something passed between them that neither Pemberton's cruelty nor Edmund's careful poison could touch, and Eleanor thought, climbing into the carriage beside Lucy with Julian settling across from them, his jaw still tight with the aftermath of anger, that whatever Edmund was building toward, it would take considerably more than gossip and a bad-mannered lord to undo what had grown between them in these past weeks. Lucy, sitting between them in the swaying carriage, reached over at some point during the ride and took Eleanor's hand in hers, small and warm, and entirely without ceremony, and Eleanor understood the gesture for what it was, a child's quiet declaration of loyalty in the face of a world that had just shown her, plainly, how cruel it could be to the people she loved. "They were saying terrible things about you," Lucy said, very softly, once the lights of Lady Whitcomb's house had faded behind them into the dark. "I do not understand why people who do not even know you would want to say such things." "People are often unkind to things they do not understand, Lucy," Eleanor said. "It is easier than trying to understand them." "Well, I understand you," Lucy said, with the fierce, uncomplicated certainty of a girl who had decided something important and did not intend to be argued out of it. "And I do not care what Lady Whitcomb or that awful Lord Pemberton think they know." Julian, watching the exchange from across the carriage, said nothing for a long moment. But Eleanor saw his throat move as he swallowed something that looked very much like emotion he was not yet ready to put into words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, meant for both of them and for himself in equal measure. "No," he said, "neither do I." The rest of the ride passed in a silence that felt, for the first time that evening, entirely comfortable, the carriage wheels turning steadily beneath them, the dark countryside sliding past the windows, and Eleanor found herself thinking, despite everything that had happened on that lawn, that she had rarely felt as safe as she felt in that carriage, between a girl who had claimed her as family and a man who had just told an entire county, without a single flinch, exactly where his loyalties stood. She did not yet know how much more Edmund was prepared to try. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, addressed to Julian in handwriting Eleanor did not recognize, and she knew before he had finished reading it that whatever it contained had changed something in the room's very air. He read it twice, standing very still by the library window, and then he set it down on the desk and looked at Eleanor with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not fear exactly, and not anger, but something colder and more focused than either. The look of a man who has finally been handed the missing piece of a puzzle he has spent 3 years avoiding. "It is from a footman who worked here at the time of the fire," Julian said. "He was dismissed shortly after, for reasons that were never explained to me at the time. I always assumed it was simply cost-cutting, in the grief and confusion of that year. He says he has been carrying something on his conscience for 3 years, and can no longer keep silent." "What does it say?" "That he saw Edmund near the east wing that night, before the fire started. That Edmund paid him afterward, generously, to say nothing of it, and paid him again every year since to continue saying nothing, until his conscience finally outweighed the money." Julian's hand, resting on the desk, had curled slowly into a fist. "He says Edmund was carrying a lit candle into a room that had no reason to need one, at an hour when the household had already retired for the night." The library seemed to hold its breath around them. Eleanor crossed the room and put her hand over his fist, feeling the tension in it, the barely restrained violence of a man who had just learned that the person he had trusted, however imperfectly, for the whole of his life, had very likely killed his wife, and let him carry the blame for 3 long years. "You must confront him," Eleanor said, "but carefully. If this is true, he is more dangerous than either of us understood." "I intend to do exactly that," Julian said, and something in his voice frightened her, not because she thought he would do anything reckless, but because she recognized, for the first time, the anger that lived beneath his careful composure, the anger he had spent 3 years directing inward, instead of outward, at himself, for a crime that had never been his to carry. Edmund arrived at Ashbourne Hall that same afternoon, unaware that anything had changed, expecting the same easy welcome he had always received, and found instead Julian waiting for him alone in the study, the footman's letter laid open on the desk between them. "Sit down, Edmund," Julian said, and his cousin, reading something final in his tone, sat. What followed was not shouted, though Eleanor, waiting anxiously in the hall with Lucy pressed close against her side, could hear the low, taut shape of it through the heavy study door. "You will deny it, I suppose," Julian said, once the door had closed behind them. "Deny what, precisely?" Edmund said, though his voice had already lost the easy confidence it usually carried. "A footman's letter? A man dismissed years ago, likely still bitter over his own dismissal, inventing a story he thinks will earn him a payment from you instead of from me? He named the sum you paid him, he named the date, he named the candle." Julian's voice was very quiet, which Eleanor had learned over the past weeks was far more dangerous than shouting. "I do not require his testimony before a magistrate to know the truth of it, Edmund. I only require you to look at me and tell me it is a lie." There was a long silence, long enough that Eleanor, pressed close to the door with Lucy trembling against her side, wondered whether Edmund would simply refuse to answer at all. "It was never meant to be her," Edmund said finally, and his voice had changed entirely, stripped of its charm, gone thin and desperate. "I swear to you, Julian, I never meant it to touch Beatrice. I meant only for you. A small fire, contained, enough to force you from the house so I might inherit sooner rather than waiting on your good health for another 40 years. I did not know she had gone to check on Lucy. I did not know she would be in that wing at all. You set a fire in my house, intending to kill me, and you are asking me to find comfort in the fact that you only meant to murder one of us instead of both." "I have paid for it every day since," Edmund said. "Do you think I have not? Do you think I have slept easily, watching you carry guilt that was mine to carry, watching Lucy grow up believing her brother nearly failed her, when the truth was that I very nearly succeeded in destroying this entire family, For the sake of a title I have spent every year since discovering I did not even truly want. That is not an apology, Julian said. That is only an excuse dressed up to sound like suffering. What would you have me do? Edmund's voice cracked upward now, desperate and pleading. Confess it to a magistrate and watch this family's name dragged through every newspaper in London? Watch Lucy grow up as the sister of a murdered duchess and the cousin of the man who killed her? I have hurt you enough, Julian. I will not let my confession hurt her too. You do not get to decide, now, after 3 years of silence, that you are suddenly protecting this family, Julian said. You lost that right the night you carried a lit candle into a room that had no reason to need one. The silence that followed was long and terrible, before the door opened and Edmund walked out white-faced and shaking, refusing to look at either Eleanor or Lucy as he crossed the hall and left the house without another word. Julian told her the whole of it that evening, once Lucy had been settled to bed with Mrs. Price sitting close beside her, unwilling to leave the girl alone after the day's tension. He did not deny it, Julian said, staring into the fire, his voice hollow in a way Eleanor had not heard since the first weeks of her arrival. He tried at first and then he simply stopped trying, because he could see I already knew. He never meant for Beatrice to die. He meant the fire for me. He thought if I died without an heir, the title would pass to him cleanly, without question, without waiting. He did not know she had gone to check on Lucy that night, and was in the East Wing instead of her own rooms. He has spent 3 years watching me blame myself for a death he caused, and doing nothing to correct it, because correcting it would have cost him everything he wanted. What will you do? I do not know yet, Julian said. There is no simple justice for something like this. I could bring it before a magistrate, but the scandal would fall on this family, and on Lucy, as much as it would fall on him, and I have already watched gossip nearly destroy something I care for once this month. I could simply cut him off, send him away, strip him of every expectation he has built his life around. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps nothing will ever be enough. He turned to look at her then, and the rawness in his face made her chest ache. I have spent 3 years believing I failed her, that I was not fast enough, not clever enough, that some flaw in my own character let the fire take her. And now I learn the truth is worse in an entirely different way, that it was never a fire I could have prevented at all, only a man I trusted who set it deliberately, and let me drown in guilt that was never mine to carry. It was never yours, Eleanor said, kneeling beside his chair and taking both his hands in hers. Not one moment of it. You went back into a burning house for her, Julian. You carried your sister out with your own hands and then turned around and went back in for your wife, and no man who did that failed anyone. The only person who failed here is the one who lit the candle. He looked at her for a long moment, something breaking open behind his eyes, 3 years of carefully held guilt finally beginning, painfully, to loosen its grip, and then he pulled her into his arms, and held on as though she were the only solid thing left standing in a world that had just tilted sideways beneath him. But the peace of that evening did not last. 2 days later Edmund returned, not to the house itself, but to society, moving through drawing rooms and clubs with the desperate, cornered energy of a man who understood he had very little left to lose. If he could not save his inheritance, he seemed to have decided, he could at least make certain Julian's happiness cost him something in return. The rumors that spread this time were uglier than anything Pemberton or Lady Whitcomb had managed. Edmund whispered, carefully and to precisely the right ears, that the governess at Ashbourne Hall had bewitched a grieving duke into turning against his own family, that she had somehow orchestrated the footman's sudden confession for her own gain, perhaps even that she had known the footman before, had arranged the whole scheme to secure her own position in the household through manufactured scandal. None of it was true. All of it spread with the terrible speed that lies always seem to travel faster than truth ever managed. Eleanor felt the change first in the way tradesmen in the village grew suddenly cool toward her, in the way invitations that had begun, tentatively, to arrive for her as Julian's companions stopped coming altogether, in the small, cutting silences that fell over shops and lanes whenever she passed through the village on her own. Her aunt's letter arrived a few days later, the handwriting more hurried than usual, betraying the worry beneath the careful, proper phrasing. My dear Eleanor, it began, I have heard troubling talk making its way through certain circles regarding your position at Ashbourne Hall, and though I know you to be a sensible and honest woman, incapable of the behavior being whispered about, I confess I am concerned for your reputation, which once lost is not easily recovered, whatever the truth of the matter may be. You have always been headstrong, my dear, a trait I have long admired in private and scolded in public, but I beg you to consider whether this particular position is still one worth the cost it may soon demand of you. There is no shame in stepping back from a situation that has grown larger and more dangerous than the simple work of teaching a young girl her letters. Eleanor read the letter twice, sitting alone in her room with the candle burning low, and felt the old, familiar pull of caution her aunt had spent years teaching her, the instinct to retreat before the damage became permanent, to protect what little reputation a woman in her position could claim as her own. She wrote back that same night, her hands steady despite the ache in her chest, thanking her aunt for the concern and explaining, as gently as she could, that she did not intend to leave a family she had come to love simply because cruelty had decided to make her presence costly. Whatever came of it, she wrote, she would rather face it honestly than spend the rest of her life wondering what she had abandoned out of fear. It reached its breaking point, regardless, when Lucy came home in tears from a rare visit to a neighboring family's house. It reached its breaking point when Lucy came home in tears from a rare visit to a neighboring family's house. Having overheard the lady of that house telling her own daughter that Miss Hartley was no better than a fortune hunter who had used dark tricks to turn a grieving man's head, and that decent families ought not to associate with a household so thoroughly compromised. They said you were going to ruin us, Lucy sobbed, curled against Eleanor's side that night. They said Julian was a fool to trust you and that everyone could see it except him. Eleanor held the girl close, her own throat tight with an anger she had not let herself feel until now, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that this was precisely what Edmund had wanted. Not merely to hurt her, but to make her presence in this house a burden Julian and Lucy would have to carry, a scandal that would follow them both for years, and to make her love them enough to consider leaving simply to spare them the cost of it. She found Julian alone in the library late that night, staring into a dying fire, and told him what she had begun to consider. "Perhaps I should go," she said quietly, "not because I want to, because every day I stay, Edmund finds some new way to make my presence cost you and Lucy something neither of you deserve to pay." "No," Julian said, and there was a fierceness in the word that startled her. "I have spent 3 years letting other people's fear decide how I live in my own house, my own life. I will not spend the next 3 doing the same thing with you. Edmund does not get to win simply because he is willing to be crueler than anyone else is willing to be kind. And if the scandal never ends, if Lucy is made to suffer for it, for years, simply because I stayed, then we face it together, and it ends when I decide it ends, not when Edmund decides he has punished us enough." He crossed the room and took her face gently in his scarred hands, tilting it up to meet his eyes. "I did not survive that fire, Eleanor, and I did not survive 3 years of my own guilt afterward, only to let my cousin's cruelty finish what the flames could not. I love you. I do not intend to let him take that from either of us." It was the first time he had said the word aloud, and Eleanor felt it land in her chest like something long awaited finally arriving, warm and certain despite the storm still gathering outside the walls of Ashbourne Hall. "I love you too," she said, and meant it entirely. "But loving you does not solve the problem Edmund has made of us in the eyes of every drawing room in the county." "No," Julian agreed, "but it means we solve it together, or not at all. And I find, having thought about it a great deal these past days, that I have a rather particular idea of exactly how to end it." He would not tell her the whole of the plan that night, only that it involved Lady Whitcomb, an invitation to the largest gathering of the season, and the kind of public honesty he had spent 3 years avoiding at any cost. And Eleanor, watching the fire find something steady and resolved in his eyes for the first time since the letter had arrived, allowed herself, cautiously, to hope. Lady Whitcomb's ballroom had never held so many candles at once, or so Eleanor thought, standing at the top of the grand staircase in a gown Julian had insisted on having made for her, deep blue silk that fit as though it had been designed for exactly this moment, which, she suspected, it had. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly, as the first faces below began turning toward the staircase, the way faces always turned when a duke arrived. "I want to do this," Julian said, offering her his arm. "I have spent 3 years letting other people decide the story of my life. Tonight I intend to tell it myself." They descended together, and the music did not stop this time, though the room's attention gathered around them all the same, whispers rising like heat off summer stone. Eleanor kept her chin level and her hand steady on Julian's arm, and if her heart was beating hard enough to feel in her throat, she did not let it show on her face. Lady Whitcomb herself met them at the base of the stairs, her expression a careful blend of curiosity and calculation, the hostess of the season's most talked-about scandal, now hosting the 2 people at its center. "Your Grace," she said, "Miss Hartley, I confess I did not expect either of you to accept my invitation, given recent talk. That is precisely why we accepted it. Julian said. "I understand you host the largest gathering in the county tonight. It seemed the appropriate place to correct a few things that talk has gotten badly wrong." A hush moved through the nearby guests, the particular hush of people pretending not to listen while listening very closely indeed. Julian did not lower his voice. If anything, he let it carry, the way he had never once let it carry in 3 years of avoiding rooms exactly like this one. "Several of you have heard a story this season," he said, "about a governess who bewitched a grieving duke, who manufactured scandal for her own gain, who used dark tricks to turn a fool's head. I would like to tell you the true story instead, since apparently no one else has troubled themselves with accuracy." He told it plainly, without flourish. The way Eleanor had come to understand, he told the things that mattered most to him. He spoke of the fire 3 years ago, and of a footman's letter, and of a candle carried into a room that had no reason to need one. He did not name Edmund outright at first, circling the truth carefully, giving his cousin one last unearned mercy, but the shape of it was unmistakable to anyone who had known the family long enough to remember who had stood to gain most from a duke's death. A murmur swept the ballroom, disbelief giving way, gradually, to something closer to horrified understanding. Eleanor felt eyes shifting away from her for the first time in weeks, no longer hunting for scandal in her face but searching the crowd instead for a man in a deep green coat who had, she noticed only now, gone very pale near the refreshment table. "Miss Hartley," Julian continued, turning to her now, his voice softening though it lost none of its carrying strength, "did not bewitch me, or manufacture anything, or use any trick beyond the plainest one there is. She looked at my face without flinching, on a night when no one else in a crowded room could manage the same small kindness, and she has looked at me the same way every day since, through gossip and threats and the worst 3 weeks this county has apparently ever enjoyed discussing. If that is witchcraft, then I confess myself thoroughly and permanently enchanted, and I do not intend to ask for a cure." Somewhere behind Eleanor, a woman laughed, startled and genuine, and the sound broke something loose in the tense hush of the room, ripples of soft laughter and murmured surprise spreading outward from it. Eleanor felt her own eyes stinging, and she did not try very hard to stop it. It was Edmund who broke first, unable to bear the weight of every eye in the ballroom slowly turning toward him as understanding finished settling over the crowd. He pushed through the guests toward the door, his composure entirely gone, and Julian let him go, watching his cousin's retreat with an expression that held more exhaustion than triumph in it. "I do not need him punished by a room full of strangers," Julian said quietly to Eleanor, once the worst of the crowd's attention had shifted to murmured, urgent conversation rather than open staring. "I only needed them to know the truth. What happens to Edmund now is a matter for lawyers and family, not for gossip." What did happen, in the weeks that followed, was quieter than society might have hoped for, though no less final. Edmund left the country within a fortnight, his allowance from the estate cut entirely, his name struck from the line of inheritance through a legal process Julian's solicitors handled with grim, thorough efficiency. He did not face a magistrate in the end, sparing Lucy the newspapers Julian had feared, but he left with nothing of the future he had spent 3 years scheming to secure, and Eleanor suspected that particular loss weighed on him far more heavily than any court sentence could have managed. Lord Pemberton, for his part, found himself quietly dropped from every guest list of consequence for the remainder of the season, Lady Whitcomb herself leading the charge with the enthusiasm of a woman who had realized, rather too late, which side of the story she ought to have championed from the beginning. Lucy took the news of Edmund's departure harder than either Julian or Eleanor expected, not because she mourned his absence, but because she had spent years calling him cousin, sitting across from him at family dinners, accepting small gifts from him on her birthday, without ever once suspecting the truth of what he had done. She sat with Eleanor in the schoolroom one gray afternoon, turning a small carved horse he had once given her over and over in her hands, trying to reconcile the man who had smiled at her across a dinner table with the man who had let her brother carry 3 years of guilt that was never his to carry. "I do not know if I am allowed to be sad about it," Lucy admitted quietly. "He did something terrible. He hurt Julian, and he was going to hurt you too, if he could have managed it. But I still remember him teaching me to ride, before all of this. Is it wrong to remember that, and be sad, even now?" "It is not wrong at all," Eleanor said, sitting beside her, and taking the small carved horse gently from her hands, turning it over once herself, before setting it on the table between them. "People are rarely only one thing, Lucy. He did something unforgivable, and that does not erase every ordinary kindness that came before it, but it also does not excuse it. You are allowed to grieve the cousin you thought you knew, and be glad, at the very same time, that he is gone from this house." Lucy considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly, the particular nod of a child working through something too large for easy comfort, and slid the little horse into a drawer of her desk, where Eleanor noticed, months later, it still remained, tucked away but never quite thrown out entirely. It took the better part of that autumn for the sharpest edges of the scandal to wear smooth, the way scandal always eventually did, worn down by newer gossip and the simple passage of time. Ashbourne Hall itself seemed to soften along with it. The last of the overgrown gardens finally cleared. New curtains hung in rooms that had stood shuttered since the fire, laughter becoming, at last, an unremarkable sound within its walls rather than a rare and startling one. Eleanor, meanwhile, found her own standing transformed in ways she had not expected and did not entirely trust at first. Invitations arrived again, this time in greater number than before, though she accepted very few of them, having discovered that she cared considerably less for society's approval now that she had survived so thoroughly without it. It was on a quiet evening some weeks later, in the same garden where the rose bed had once stood overgrown and neglected, now trimmed and blooming under Julian's patient attention, that he asked her to marry him. He did not do it with an audience, or a speech prepared for effect. He simply took her hand as they walked, the way he had taken it on the stone wall outside the stables all those weeks ago, and told her, plainly, that he did not wish to spend one more day of his life without her in it, however many years that life turned out to hold. "I love you," he said, "not despite anything this house or this scar or this cruel county has put us through, but because you walked through all of it without once looking away. I do not know how to offer you an ordinary life, Eleanor. I am not sure I have one left to offer. But I can offer you an honest one, and I find I would rather have that with you than anything easier with anyone else." "I never wanted ordinary," Eleanor said, her voice thick with feeling. "I wanted honest. You have given me that from the very first night we met, when you asked me why I was looking at you instead of simply assuming you already knew." Their wedding, when it came that autumn, was a smaller affair than most of the county expected of a duke, held in the chapel at Ashbourne Hall, with only family and true friends in attendance, Lucy standing at the front in a new dress of her own choosing, beaming in a way that made half the small gathering reach for their handkerchiefs before the ceremony had even properly begun. Eleanor stood at the chapel door beside her aunt, who had, in the end, come around entirely to the match, and looked down the short aisle to where Julian waited, and thought of that first night, the ballroom gone silent around a man everyone had decided to fear, a stranger's ordinary smile the only thing in the whole crowded room that had dared to see him plainly. She walked toward him now with the same steady, unafraid gaze she had given him then, and watched his composure, so carefully held through 3 years of grief and 3 months of scandal, finally break into something open and unguarded and entirely his own, a smile that reached every part of his face, scarred and unscarred alike, without a trace of the old bracing tension that had once lived in his shoulders. When it came time for their vows, Julian did not use the words the vicar had written out for him beforehand. He set the paper aside, took both of Eleanor's hands in his, and spoke plainly, the way he had learned, over the past year, to speak about the things that mattered most to him. "I spent 3 years believing I was a man people had every right to fear," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion beneath it. "You taught me otherwise, not with grand gestures, but with the simple, stubborn habit of looking at me the same way every single day, whether the room around us was kind or cruel. I promise to spend whatever years I am given looking back at you exactly the same way, without flinching, without looking away, for as long as you will have me." Eleanor, her own voice unsteady with the effort of holding back tears she no longer saw any reason to hide, answered in kind, and the small gathering in the chapel, family and true friends alike, found themselves reaching for handkerchiefs long before the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife. The words met with an outburst of applause more suited to a country celebration than a formal ducal wedding, which Julian afterward admitted he had found considerably more to his taste than the alternative. Months later, at a ball not unlike the one where they had first met, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne arrived together, and the room, this time, did not fall silent with fear. It fell quiet with something else entirely, the particular hush that gathers around a couple who have clearly weathered something together and come out the other side of it whole. And when Julian led Eleanor onto the floor for the first dance, his scarred face turned toward her without a trace of the old flinching wariness, more than one guest in that ballroom found themselves thinking, with something like envy, that they had never before seen a man look quite so unafraid to be seen. Lucy watched from the edge of the room, grown an inch taller and considerably braver over the past year, and thought that whatever else the world had tried to take from her family, it had never once managed to take the thing that mattered most, which was simply the courage to keep loving one another out loud, in front of anyone who cared to watch. The Duke of Ashbourne had spent 3 years being the man everyone feared to look at. He spent the rest of his life being the man his wife had never once looked away from, and found, to his quiet and lasting surprise, that it was a far better story than the one society had spent so long telling in his place. The scream that tore through Ashbourne Hall on a cold February night, a year after the wedding, was not one of fear this time, though for several long hours it frightened Julian far more than any fire ever had. He paced the hallway outside the bedroom door while a midwife and 2 maids moved briskly in and out with basins of water and low, urgent instructions, and Mrs. Price, grown grayer but no less steady in the year since the scandal had finally settled, kept a firm hand on his arm each time he tried to push past her and through the door. "It is not a place for you yet, Your Grace," she said, not unkindly, for perhaps the 10th time that night. "Babies come in their own time, and Her Grace is strong. Trust that, if nothing else." He trusted it, or told himself he did, though nothing in 3 years of learning to survive his own grief had prepared him for the particular helplessness of standing outside a closed door while the person he loved most in the world labored on the other side of it, her voice rising now and then in a way that made his chest ache with a fear entirely unlike the fear of fire and scars and cruel gossip that had once ruled his life. Lucy sat on the stairs nearby, 13 now, and trying very hard to appear composed, though she had not stopped twisting the hem of her sleeve since midnight. "Was it like this when I was born?" she asked quietly, when Julian finally sat down beside her, unable to pace any longer. "I do not remember," Julian admitted. "I was only 8, and our parents kept me well away from this part of the house. I remember being told I had a sister, and being deeply unimpressed that she could not yet talk to me, and demanding to know when that particular flaw would be corrected." Lucy laughed, startled out of her worry for a moment, and leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had when she was much younger, before the fire, before 3 years of careful distance had grown between them without either of them quite choosing it. "She will be all right," Lucy said, though it was not entirely clear whether she meant it as comfort for him or for herself. "Eleanor is the bravest person either of us knows. She faced down an entire ballroom of gossips without blinking. I do not think a baby stands much chance against her." It was nearly dawn when the midwife finally opened the door. Exhaustion and satisfaction mingled plainly on her face, and told Julian he could come in now, that his wife was asking for him, that he had a daughter, small and loud and entirely healthy. He crossed the room to find Eleanor propped against a mountain of pillows, pale and worn but smiling in a way that undid every knot of fear that had gathered in his chest through the long night, a small, furious, red-faced bundle held against her chest, already protesting the indignity of having been born at all. "She has your temper," Eleanor said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and laughter both. "I have known her for exactly 4 minutes and I can already tell." Julian sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at his daughter, and felt something settle in his chest that he had not expected to feel again after the fire had taken so much. A quiet, certain sense that the future had opened up wider than he had ever let himself imagine it could, in the years when he had believed himself a man too damaged for anyone to look at without flinching. "What shall we call her?" he asked. "I had thought," Eleanor said, "that we might call her Beatrice." Julian went still, looking up from the baby to meet his wife's eyes, and found no hesitation there, only the same steady, unflinching honesty she had offered him since the night they first met. "You do not have to carry that grief for me," he said quietly. "I do not want our daughter's name to be a burden she never asked for." "It is not a burden," Eleanor said. "It is a kindness. Beatrice deserves to be remembered as more than the worst night of your life, Julian. She deserves to be remembered as someone you loved, and someone whose memory helped make room, eventually, for the rest of us. I would like our daughter to carry a piece of that forward, if you are willing." He was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the small, furious face of his daughter, and then he leaned forward and kissed his wife's forehead, unable, for a moment, to find any words equal to what he felt. "Beatrice Eleanor Ashbourne," he said finally. "I think that suits her very well." News of the birth traveled through the county with far more warmth than any gossip about the family had managed in years past, well-wishes arriving by the dozen from households that had once been careful to keep their distance, and Eleanor found, reading through the small mountain of letters a week later while baby Beatrice slept in a cradle beside the bed, that even Lady Whitcomb had sent a note of congratulation, along with a christening gift far more generous than strictly necessary, which Eleanor suspected was less about genuine affection and more about a hostess never wanting to be on the wrong side of a story twice. Edmund's name came up only once more that year, In a brief letter from a solicitor overseas confirming that he had settled quietly in a small town on the continent, taken up work as a tutor under an assumed name, and asked, through the solicitor, whether Julian would permit him to send Lucy a letter on her next birthday. Julian considered it for several days before showing the request to Lucy herself, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. "I do not think I want to hear from him yet," Lucy said, after a long silence. "Perhaps someday, not yet." Julian respected that without argument, and wrote back through the solicitor to say as much, and the matter was allowed to rest, unresolved but no longer urgent, the way old wounds sometimes had to be allowed to simply exist rather than be forced toward an ending that was not yet ready to arrive. Beatrice's christening was held that summer in the same small chapel where Julian and Eleanor had married, and this time the gathering spilled well beyond family and close friends, half the county apparently deciding that an invitation to witness the Ashbourne heir's christening was not one to be refused, whatever the private opinions any of them had once whispered about the household. Eleanor watched them arrive with a private, quiet amusement, remembering how few of these same families had wanted to be seen anywhere near Ashbourne Hall only a year before. Lucy stood as godmother, an honor she had accepted with a seriousness well beyond her 13 years, holding the baby with careful, practiced arms, while the vicar spoke the old familiar words over her. Afterward, on the chapel steps, she turned to Eleanor with an expression that had grown, over the past year, steadily more confident, less watchful, the guarded stillness of the frightened girl in the schoolroom slowly giving way to something warmer and more settled. "Do you remember what you told me," Lucy said, "on my very first day of lessons? That I seemed entirely reasonable, and it was only 10 in the morning." "I remember," Eleanor said, smiling. "I think about that sometimes. How strange it is that something so small could be the beginning of all of this." Lucy looked down at the baby in her arms, then back up at Eleanor, her eyes bright. "I am glad you were not afraid of us, either of us." "There was never anything to be afraid of," Eleanor said. "Only two people who had forgotten for a while that they were allowed to be loved out loud." Lucy considered that for a moment, then handed the baby carefully back to her mother, and the two of them walked together down the chapel steps into the warm summer light, Julian waiting at the bottom with an expression of such open, uncomplicated happiness that more than one guest, watching him, found it difficult to remember the guarded, silent man who had once haunted every ballroom he was forced to enter. The following spring came early and generous, and the garden at Ashbourne Hall bloomed more fully than it had in a decade, roses climbing the old stone walls in colors Julian had not bothered to plant since before the fire. He took to carrying Beatrice out into the garden most mornings, walking the same paths he had once walked with Eleanor during those careful, early weeks of courtship, now narrating the names of flowers to a daughter far too young to understand a word of it, though she seemed, in her small, solemn way, to enjoy the sound of his voice regardless. Eleanor watched them from the terrace some mornings, coffee cooling forgotten in her hands, and thought of the ballroom where all of this had begun, the silence that had fallen the moment Julian walked through the door, the fear that had once ruled every room he entered. That fear was gone now, worn away by a year of ordinary mornings and small, accumulated kindnesses, replaced by something steadier and far more durable, a household that had learned, against every expectation society had once held for it, how to be happy out loud. She thought, too, of her own small part in it, the smile she had given a stranger across a crowded room without any plan beyond simple honesty, and marveled, still, at how far a single unguarded moment could travel, given enough time and enough courage to follow where it led. The Duke of Ashbourne, once the man everyone feared, walked his garden every morning now with his daughter in his arms and his wife watching from the terrace, and if any ghost of the old fire still lingered in the corners of that house, it had long since been outnumbered by everything that had grown, deliberately and patiently, in its place.